Hey, YouTube faithful, Steve Rosen here with another tale, with another audio tale for all you guys to dig on. This interview with Slash I did back in March 2016. Um, I got a phone call from Guitar World magazine, and they wanted to do a cover with Slash and Ace, revolving around Ace's Origins Volume 1 record, his record of cover songs. So they sent me to the photo shoot where Ace and Slash were, doing photos for what would be the Guitar World cover. It was pouring rain that day. I mean, it was insane. So I got there a little bit early to make sure I was all cool and set up and everything. And Slash was already there, and Ace showed up just a few minutes late. So they come in, and I'm watching the photo shoot, and I feel somebody tap me on the shoulder, and it is Slash's manager or publicist or some flunky gopher handler guy. And he says, "Hey man, you shouldn't really be in here while they're doing the photo shoot. Why don't you go in the other room?" And I look at this guy and I tell you, man, I was ready to fucking cut him down big time. It's like, sorry guys, my camera's slipping there. Like, right, like Slash is so important, such a big time dude that he would not want me in the room with him while he's shooting. So that left a bad, bad taste in my mouth. So after it's over with, I'm trying to get the two guys upstairs to sit down for the interview, and the publicist says, "Oh, Slash can't hang around. He's got to leave." I said, "Excuse me?" I said, "I'm here to do the cover story for Guitar World with both guys." He goes, "No, Slash can't do it. You have to do it later." So I wrote that off, and I did sit down with Ace, who was incredibly cool, and we talked for 45 minutes. And then for the next several days, I'm calling, emailing this piece of garbage publicist. "Hey, I need to get this done. I need to get this done. Guitar World is breathing down my neck. When are we going to do this?" Guy kept putting me off. And finally, I was able to arrange a phone interview with Slash. So, what you're reading, if any of you ever read that cover story in Guitar World with Ace and Slash, is two separate interviews that I put together to make believe that it was one interview done at one sitting. And actually, a lot of the Guitar World covers were done that way. When you see photos of, I don't know, Tony Iommi and James Hetfield, those guys were probably not in the same room. In any event, I really like this interview. Slash talks all about hanging out with Ace and, being a Kiss fan, and talks about Cream and his guitar heroes and, early Appetite days. Very cool interview. The one drawback is that for some freaking reason, this interview came out in mono, so the quality might suck a bit. But if you can get past the quality, I think you'll really dig on what Slash is talking about. And again, people, please remember to like and subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I really appreciate it, man. Everybody's doing good, I hope. You take care of yourselves, and I hope you enjoyed the interview. Bye.
You were a Kiss fan and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, what was that like when he gave you the shout to play on that song?
It was good. I mean, it was great. I love that song, and I've been threatening to play on an Ace record for the last two records. And the schedules haven't lined up properly, and so it sort of bummed me out that, not having done it. And so then finally this particular record, it worked out, and it was a great song. It's a fucking great record. I don't know if you heard the whole
Yeah, no, I have. It is really good. To be honest, I was surprised how good that stuff came out. Yeah. Yeah.
So I was stoked to do it. It was a fun little session, and like that.
Yeah. So it was actually your idea. I guess Ace had initially kind of done like every other kind of little solo thing in that little section, and then he was going to kind of slot you in, but that didn't quite work. So you had suggested both you guys kind of just doing it live in the studio.
Well, I don't know if I know what we did was I went down there and it was at this little house in the Hollywood Hills, and up in Laurel Canyon actually, that's where the studio was. And I went over there, and he had recorded the song with this really extended solo section, and he was going to put down his solo, right?
Yeah.
All the way across the whole section. Then, so when I got there, he wanted me just to do an extended solo all the way through.
Oh, I see.
Like, the whole thing, and I was like, wow. And then you're going to cut it all together. It just didn't appeal to me. That concept of doing it. Not to mention, I didn't have a lot of time. So I said, why don't we just do it live? Where, we just play back and forth right here in the moment and do it like that. And so that's how we did it. And we did it in about, I don't know, a couple takes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think probably 3 takes of him and me just jamming back and forth. And they probably just spliced together the best of that.
That's cool. And you'd mentioned you were kind of a fan of that song and kind of Thin Lizzy in general. I mean, I think that's probably how Scott Gorham and Brian Robertson must have done it. Kind of those.
Yeah, well, the old school way is always the way that I try to force it still. I mean, sometimes in modern recording, it's just the way that it's set up. You have to sort of do it in a more modern fashion, which is really piecemeal.
Yeah.
But whenever I can try and do things in a sort of more spontaneous live setting, I do, and this was one of those situations.
Interesting.
I Ace is old school, so it was no problem.
Yeah. I mean, certainly. I mean, I would think that's how Ace kind of approaches things as well. Kind of that old school, that kind of that organic thing. Certainly in his solos. Ace has talked about having this very unorthodox approach to his guitar playing in his solos, and this strange little vibrato that he does, and those kind of weird Jimmy Page sort of pull-off things. I mean, would you describe your own style / as kind of an unorthodox approach? I mean, do you think you?
Well, I mean, I really don't know what to compare it to. I mean, I just sort of do what I do, and have been doing that for obviously as long as I've been playing.
Yeah.
And I'm aware of what guys do. Sort of nowadays, which is, in a way, it's great because you get all that technical showmanship together, and they rehearse everything out, and they write everything out, and it's all very calculated, and it ends up sounding really bitchin' on the record at the end of the day. But I just never have prescribed that method, or subscribed to that method. I just sort of like to do it, and if the inspiration is there, it's great. And if it's not, hopefully you're a good enough player to sort of put it together as best as you can in the moment, as opposed to thinking it out, So I do see that a lot of guys do that these days. And then the guitarists that influence me, for the most part, I'd like to think that most of that stuff is improv and not, totally calculated.
Absolutely.
I don't ask a lot of questions. I never read a lot of guitar magazines coming up, so I'm not really sure.
Yeah, no. I absolutely agree with you. I mean, if you had to list kind of those, I mean, I think that you share. Well, I know you share a lot of the same kind of influences that Ace does. But I mean, if you had to kind of, list, 6 of the kind of the biggest influences on you, who would you say at this moment?
It would have to be, early Eric Clapton, early Jeff Beck, early Jimmy Page, early Aerosmith. I want to say it's a toss-up. I mean, I want to say Jimi Hendrix because that was a really big one. But there's so many different guitar players. So I'll say off the top of my head, those were the guys that, Angus Young, all through, pretty much all the AC/DC. He's always been pretty consistent.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I mean, the list could go on and on.
Oh, of course, and it's interesting also that, I mean, most of those guys are either, Les Paul or kind of Gibson guys. I mean, obviously Hendrix isn't. But I think I'd spoken to you before, and you really weren't aware of the kinds of guitars these guys were getting, the kind of the guitars these guys were playing when you sort of got your first Les Paul, and it was a Les Paul copy. Is that true? I mean, you just knew that you kind of dug the sound, but you weren't quite sure what they were playing?
Well, I remember A Whole Lot of Love being the biggest sonic influence on me way before I ever thought about picking up a guitar.
Oh, really?
When I was a kid, my parents had Zeppelin 4 and Zeppelin 1, 2, and 4. I think all the first 4 records, 1 through 4. And I remember, like certain songs had a certain sound to it that Zeppelin did. And I never thought about it at the time. I just remember those appealing to me. So when I picked up the guitar, I sort of gravitated towards what Jimmy Page was doing as far as guitar sound and even style was concerned. And I found that a lot of the stuff that I liked later on, I found out these were all humbucker type deals and Les Paul type deals.
Mm-hmm.
But I think visually, the Les Paul, technically not knowing much about either the difference between a Strat and the Les Paul, visually the Les Paul appealed to me. I'd seen Jimmy Page with it, so he put those two things together. And so it was always that kind of a sound that appealed to me. And as I started experimenting with different guitars, I discovered what a Strat was all about. And I think actually Strats are the best rock and roll guitars if you find a good one. But I just feel comfortable on a Les Paul, and I've always gone back to that. And at this point, I very rarely will ever pick up the Strat if I'm in the studio. I mean, it would have to be something very specific.
That is so interesting. I mean, I know that obviously you and Ace are kind of, Les Paul Marshall guys. I mean, what I thought was so wonderful about the Emerald track was, both you guys plugging into, I'm assuming, Marshalls with the Les Pauls, and just how different your tones were. I mean, is there any way to kind of describe, kind of the difference in tones, or how is it that...
I mean, that wasn't, neither one of us, that wasn't our gear.
It wasn't your gear?
We were struggling that day. For some reason, at this session, he didn't have any of his gear there. So these were Marshalls that were laying around in the studio, and I can't say that either one of them really sounded that great.
Oh, really?
We just had to make do with what we had at hand. We did have our own guitars. I brought mine from my house, and he had his. But the amps, we it was really like, I'm so used to doing sessions with whatever resources that are available. I just sort of made the amp sound as best as you could possibly make it sound. I was like, okay, we're done. And then Ace was sort of like, fuck, can't you make it sound any better? It's like, you know what, we just have to get on with it. And that was actually how that worked.
I see. Interesting. You touched on, kind of early Clapton, Cream era stuff. Ace does White Room. Actually, it's a pretty cool version of that. I mean, what do you remember your first exposure to kind of Clapton and Cream Slash?
Well, I mean, yeah, actually, when I first picked up, before I even had a guitar, and decided that I wanted to learn how to play, and it was going to be bass at the time, and I went to a local music school, and was talking to the guitar teacher, and he was asking me, well, do you have a bass? And I was like, no. And he was trying to sort of navigate what he was dealing with me. Because
Gotcha.
I showed up without an instrument and wanted to learn how to play. And while he was talking to me, he had a black Les Paul Custom, and he was playing Sunshine of Your Love. And talking to me at the same time. And he was playing the actual, in verbatim, the solo from Sunshine of Your Love.
Wow.
And I said, well, that's what I want to do. And so it was basically Clapton that, it was what Clapton did at that time. That's what inspired me. I mean, that's what went from, I didn't know what what the difference between bass and guitar technically was. And the reason I was going to play bass is because Steve Adler at the time was playing guitar, and that seemed the natural thing to do.
Gotcha.
But I really technically didn't know that much about the difference between the two. And when I saw him playing those licks, I was like, that's what I want to do. It's not, so that's how that Clapton had some sort of influence on me picking up the guitar.
Yeah, that is so cool. You touched on Hendrix earlier. Ace does Spanish Castle Magic, which is pretty kind of an interesting choice to kind of pick that one, John 5.
It is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because everybody does kind of, well, you know what they do. I mean, it's a little bit more of a difficult song to make feel right. I mean,
translate, yeah.
Right. So,
get the interpretation to translate, right?
Exactly right. So, talking about Hendrix, sort of, what was your first exposure to Jimmy? First time you heard him?
Well, I mean, being that I was raised in the second half of the '60s, the early '70s, in England and in America, my parents were really into. They were a part of that movement. I was basically a product of that movement. So Hendrix was pretty prevalent as a kid growing up, especially when I moved to Los Angeles. So he just always had that sort of, let's see, what's the word I want to use for it? That sort of, it's like a sonic, wild man kind of impression I got
Yeah, yeah.
from him when I was a kid. And I always dug it because all his notes were so pointed compared to what everybody else was doing. And it's always stuck with me, even to this day, if I'm in the car listening to the radio and I hear Purple Haze. I mean, it's just such a defined rock and roll sound that even nowadays, when you hear it, compared to everything else, it's got a certain thing to it that is definable as him. And especially back in the day, it was just like there was nothing else that sounded like that.
Right, absolutely, and I think what you describe in sort of a fashion is kind of why we still listen to those kinds of people and why we're talking about Hendrix and Clapton and those kinds of people all these years later, is that they have sort of created this thing that has become kind of part of the vocabulary of kind of.
Well, yeah, because everybody's expanded on it and gone in different directions with it, but there's sort of like an organic, earthy kind of humanity to a lot of those early rock guitar players and their tone and just their overall, just the way that they play. It's very individual. There's one of the great things about Guitar Heroes is the reason they're Guitar Heroes is because they have an individual identity. And you really hear the person in their playing, and each one of these guys who have been what I would consider really memorable rock and roll guitar players all have a defined personality in their style and as individuals, and that's what we attach ourselves to.
That's true.
Sort of gone by the wayside over the years. But definitely something that I've always related to, not just with guitar players, but with just musicians in general.
Absolutely right, and describing it as sort of having this humanity, that's a really interesting way to put that, man. I've never heard it defined like that. All these people we're talking about, and Ace has talked about this, it's essentially, I mean, these are sort of, if they're not blues players straight up, but most of these guys were rooted in the blues. I mean, certainly Clapton and Hendrix and Keith Richards, Angus. I mean, you're
Mick Taylor was another one of those guys.
Mick Taylor, and I know that Mike Bloomfield was one of your guys.
Yeah.
I mean, right. I mean, is that blues thing part of what you do? Slash, I mean, or do you kind of, is that sort of at the foundation of what you do?
Yeah, I mean, it goes without saying. It's the backbone of all rock and roll guitar is deeply rooted in the blues. And I go back and I listen to Albert King and B.B. King and stuff. And because those guys are electric blues players to the extent that Albert King pretty much screams,
Mm-hmm.
That's the basis for even Eddie, I mean, it's the really cool rock licks that you hear in any of these guys doing is all deeply rooted. All that rock stuff is really, just sort of like blues delivered in, a high velocity.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I had asked Ace, I know this is kind of a difficult question, when he recorded the first Kiss record, if he had any sense at all of kind of, the havoc he was unleashing on the, world of rock and, with the smoking guitars and, I mean, I know it's difficult to talk about your legacy, Slash, but I mean, in many ways, I mean, you have influenced as many people in your way as I mean, Jeff Beck has in his. I mean, you've sold more records. I mean, I know that's a difficult thing to maybe digest, but that is the truth. I mean, I guess the question is, at the time, I'm certain you didn't, but when you look back at Appetite now, and it's only a Guns question I'm going to ask, I promise. I mean, certainly you can see the influence that record has had on guitar players and the sound of electric guitars and sort of resurrecting the Les Paul. I mean, can you sort of stand back and look at that and kind of comment on it, or
I really don't have a perspective on it.
you really don't?
No, I mean, it was so not a preconceived thing,
Mm-hmm.
especially at that age, where you just have you're flying by the seat of your pants and really, really living in the moment and not thinking about any of those things and what could happen in the future at all. And then, it seemed like when there was a big impact happening with the band, it was really hard to step outside of it to get a perspective on that. I never did. And so now at this point, all these years later, the one thing I do see is when I go out after gigs and sign autographs and stuff that kids are very passionate about it, and you sign a lot of guitars, and you get that probably what is the ultimate compliment, which is when somebody says that you were like a major influence on their playing, or you got them started playing, or something to that effect, and it's delivered with such sincerity. You're like, wow, it's really hard to grasp it. I can only go off of having thought the same way about, say, Joe or Jimmy or whatever.
Right, exactly.
And that's the only thing I can really sort of relate to out of it. Otherwise, it's also fantastic that it's very surreal.
I gotcha.
And it's hard to go any further with it and feel like you had, I don't know, give some perspective on what your playing has in it that would do that. Right?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. No, that is so cool. Just a few more questions, and I'll let you go. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Ace did "Fire and Water" by Free, which is just obviously an amazing song. I know that you've had sort of a relationship with Paul Rodgers and playing on the Muddy Waters Blues tribute to Muddy Waters, and doing a bunch of live stuff with him, the Hunter, all right now. I mean, was Kossoff one of your guys? I mean, were you kind of a pretty big Free fan?
Well, I mean, that was Free. I think was more of like a band that you listen to. It was sort of like one of those really great, almost mainstream rock and roll song lists that was always around. So you listen to it at home, you listen to it was on in your car, it was at the park when you were hanging out with your friends or whatever. It was just such a mainstay of sort of my rock and roll upbringing, and so that guitar was hugely influential on me. I mean, I don't think I've ever sat down with a Free record and actually sat down and learned it. I didn't know it just from the notes and the solos are the same way.
Gotcha.
You play you play into any sort of Free song that you've heard enough times, the solo automatically comes to you. And I think that's one of the great things about lead guitar playing is if you make it melodic and you make it part of the song, it becomes very memorable. And I always thought that was way more important than trying to show off how many notes or picking techniques or this or that and the other that you can do. It was always about sort of the melody that enhances the song. That's almost as important as the lead vocal, and it's something that sticks with you.
That is so cool. In 2004, Guitar World actually put together a list of the 100 greatest heavy metal guitarists. Ace was number 14, and you were number 15. I asked Ace, I asked Ace if he considered himself a heavy metal guitarist, and he said no. And I was just wondering, kind of, you being on a 100 greatest heavy metal guitarist list, how does that strike you?
I'm not. I mean, whatever. I'm not. I wouldn't consider Ace a heavy metal guitar player.
No, me neither.
I probably wouldn't consider myself a heavy metal guitar player. Although I have a tendency to write in that realm and play accordingly because I love heavy metal, but I wouldn't really call myself a bona fide heavy metal guitar player. There's way too many fantastic fucking heavy metal guitar players that do that so well. I mean, even Dave Mustaine, who I love to death.
Yeah.
He's a great rock and roll guitar player. He always gets these amazing fucking metal guitar players in his band. And I couldn't possibly compete with that. Those guys are like the ultimate metal players to me.
So if you were in Megadeth, that I mean, you could never be in Megadeth. Sort of as a
jam with Dave, so I mean I don't know about that. I mean we used to joke about it, but it would definitely be a different style.
Yeah.
you know. But most of the stuff when I hear Dave's solos, always feel more sort of spontaneous and sort of rock and rolly. His solos, then it goes into the more sort of whatever kind of technical guy, you know, the other guy's solo. I mean, there's a new guy now. He's really fucking good. And I think, you know, to give credit where credit's due, I think Dave always gets the best guitar players in his band.
No, he really does. I mean, he really
for that kind of thing, because it's normally not my cup of tea, but for some reason in Metallica, it's always perfect. I mean, not Metallica, Megadeth.
Megadeth, yeah. Though he was once in Metallica for 3 hours.
Yeah, no, I know. I've been thinking about that because I keep hearing there's the Metallica version of I can't remember the name of the song, and then I've been hearing the Megadeth version on the radio as well. One of the old songs that they both did.
I'm not sure. I don't know my history well enough.
Yeah. It's funny. I thought about it yesterday. I remembered the name, but under the pressure of having to say it right this second.
I gotcha.
But anyway, yeah. So they both have a version of the same song that's really sort of interesting to hear.
That's funny. And just to get back to Ace just for a moment, I mean, were you kind of a big Kiss/Ace fan?
Oh yeah. Let's get into this because no, actually, so what happened was I was turned on to Kiss when I was still racing BMX, and a good friend of mine was like any number of kids, like a hardcore Kiss fan. And because of the outfits and all that stuff, I really had a hard time sort of taking them seriously, so I never got into Kiss. I was very aware of them, but didn't really give them any credit because I just couldn't get past the costumes. And then when Kiss became the 80s Kiss, then they became sort of high profile in the MTV world. Then I really, at that point, sort of disliked Kiss. And then at some point along the way, as the more the 80s Kiss evolved, all of a sudden I started to really appreciate the old Kiss. And so now, at this point, I love old Kiss. And you know, all things considered, though, I always thought Gene and Ace were the coolest ones, even back in the day when it was like the 70s Kiss.
Yeah.
I always did like them, and I was always very aware of Ace, and I always thought he was like the cool rock and roll guitar player. But as a band and listening to the records, I just couldn't get into all the hype, you know. But in the 80s, all of a sudden I started to really appreciate the Kiss that I'd missed. And so still to this day, a big fan of the original Kiss. I think it was one of the all-time best sort of, big, mass decibel rock and roll bands of the 70s.
When did you...
Steve, sorry to cut you off, but we're about at 25 minutes if you got one or two more for him.
Okay.
Thanks.
Do you remember when you first met Ace?
I'm not really sure when the first time we ever met was. Yeah, because it was back in the day, and there was a lot of drinking and stuff going on, and it's just hard. Sometimes it's hard to define those moments, but it was back in I think probably I don't know, 89 or 90 or something like that.
Interesting. And sort of at the end of the day, Slash, I mean, when you kind of strap on your Les Paul and you plug into a Marshall, I mean, does that thing still bring you joy? I mean, does it?
Yeah. Are you kidding? That's why I do this as much as I do it. I'm really fortunate that I haven't become sort of what you consider jaded and sort of going through the motions for the sake of a paycheck or something. I mean, I do it because I love it.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah, that's one of the great things about Ace as well. One of the reasons he's so cool is it's such a part of his DNA. It's not something that he gets up in the morning, puts on his rock costume, and goes to work, and then comes home at night, takes it off, and becomes somebody else. I mean, he sort of lives and breathes it. And I've always had a lot of respect for guys like that.
That's great. That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Slash. You take care of yourself and play all the good notes, okay?
Okay, man. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.